The sacred parking spot was the anchor of Elias's precarious life. That single patch of asphalt outside his front door was the only thing he could count on. Elias was a man defined by his devotion, his hands calloused from the heavy lifting of his warehouse shifts and his spirit weathered by the constant anxiety of caring for a mother who seemed to be fading like a sunset. Every night, as he drove home under the flickering yellow streetlights, he prayed that his spot would be empty. It was his small, silent victory in a world that offered very few. But Arthur saw the world through a different lens. His luxury SUV was an extension of a personality that refused to be contained. The car was a behemoth of jet black paint, a metallic intruder that seemed to growl even when the engine was off. When Arthur moved into the neighborhood, he brought with him a toxic atmosphere of superiority. He didn't just ignore the unwritten rules of the street, he treated them with active contempt. He would leave his vehicle idling in the middle of the road while he took phone calls, or leave it parked across 2 spaces simply because he didn't want anyone else's beater car touching his door panels. The morning of the medical appointment was the day the tension finally turned into a tragedy. Elias had spent all night preparing for his mother's grueling treatment. This wasn't just a checkup, it was a lifeline. But as he led his mother toward their sedan, his heart sank. Arthur's SUV was angled sharply, its rear bumper hovering inches from Elias's car, while another vehicle sat just as close behind him. He was completely boxed in. The SUV was double parked, effectively turning the narrow street into a dead end. Desperate, Elias left the urgent note, his hand shaking as the ink bled into the paper. When Arthur appeared on his balcony, Elias felt a flicker of hope. Surely seeing an old woman struggling to walk would soften even the hardest heart. But Arthur's laughter was a sharp, jagged sound that cut through the morning air. He didn't say a word. He simply watched, amused by the spectacle of Elias's frantic efforts to find a solution. The taxi he eventually summoned arrived 40 minutes late, and the clinic's doors were already closed to new patients for the day. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. In the days that followed, the silence in Elias's apartment became heavy with the sound of his mother's struggling breath. The missed appointment had triggered a cascading failure of her fragile systems. Her legs swelled, and she spent most of her time drifting in a restless sleep. Each time Elias walked past the window and saw that black SUV gleaming in the sun, the resentment in his heart grew into something sharper. He realized that Arthur's arrogance wasn't just an annoyance. It was a weapon that was slowly destroying his family. Driven by a mixture of grief and fury, Elias began to dig. He found himself on a neighborhood community forum, a place usually reserved for lost cats. But deep in the archives, he found a thread titled, "The SUV Menace." There, he discovered a community of survivors. Dozens of neighbors had shared photos of their cars blocked and their peace shattered by the same man. As he read through the stories of others who had been silenced by Arthur's wealth, a dark spark of solidarity ignited. He wasn't the only one who wanted justice. The war for the street, and for his mother's dignity, was about to begin. It was no longer just about parking. It was a battle for their home. The pink slip felt heavier than any crate Elias had ever lifted at the warehouse. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the crumbling of the fragile safety net he had woven for his mother. On a gray Tuesday morning, his supervisor had finally run out of patience. 3 times in a single week, Elias had arrived nearly an hour late, his face flushed with the frantic energy of someone who had spent their morning begging a neighbor to move a mountain of black steel. The explanation about the luxury SUV didn't matter anymore. The assembly line didn't wait for petty neighborhood disputes. Walking home with his meager belongings in a cardboard box, Elias felt a cold, hard knot of desperation tighten in his chest. Every step toward his apartment was a reminder of what he had lost, and every glance at the street was a reminder of why. Arthur, however, seemed to thrive on Elias's misfortune. It was as if he could smell the defeat. The psychological warfare shifted from mere negligence to calculated cruelty. Arthur began parking the SUV with surgical precision, leaving exactly 2 inches between his passenger door and Elias's driver's side handle. To get to his car for the few interviews he managed to land, Elias was forced to perform a humiliating ritual. He had to crawl through the trunk of his aging sedan, his limbs tangling in grocery bags and spare tools, while Arthur sat on his balcony, nursing an espresso and watching with the detached amusement of a scientist observing an insect in a jar. Every scrape on Elias's knees and every bruise on his ego was a trophy for the man above. The neighbors watched from behind their curtains, pitying Elias but too afraid of Arthur's litigious reputation to intervene. But every predator has a weakness, and Arthur's was the very thing he used as a shield: his image. Late one evening, while Elias was taking out the trash, he spotted a man in a nondescript sedan parked across the street, staring intently at the SUV. The man held a tablet and a folded repossession order. Moments later, Arthur emerged from the building, his usual bravado replaced by a frantic, hushed tone as he pleaded into his phone. He spoke of missed payments, dwindling accounts, and a desperate need for just one more month to keep up appearances. The luxury vehicle wasn't a sign of success. It was a hollow shell, a leased lie that was rapidly collapsing under the weight of his ego. Elias realized then that the SUV wasn't just a car to Arthur, it was his identity. Without that gleaming black status symbol, Arthur was just a bankrupt man in a neighborhood that despised him. This revelation became the fuel for a new movement: the victims of the SUV. Elias began meeting with other neighbors who had suffered in silence. There was Sarah, a nurse who had been blocked during a double shift, and Marcus, whose grandfather's wheelchair access had been obstructed for days. They gathered in the dim light of Marcus's garage, their voices low but their eyes burning with a shared purpose. They weren't looking for violence. They wanted a correction of the scales. Elias, once the quietest man on the block, found himself leading the charge, organizing their grievances into a strategic plan of nonviolent resistance. The escalation began with small, irritating inconveniences that targeted Arthur's obsession with the car's appearance. One morning, Arthur found his pristine roof covered in premium birdseed. By noon, a swirling, defecating cloud of pigeons had turned the black paint into a Jackson Pollock nightmare of white and gray. A few days later, a ring of heavy industrial trash bins appeared around the SUV, chained together with high-tensile steel locks that no one seemed to have the key for. Shame stickers, bright neon decals with industrial-strength adhesive, began appearing on the windows, labeling the car as the neighborhood obstacle. Despite the satisfaction, a shadow hung over Elias. His mother, sensing the darkness growing in him, took his hand one evening. Her voice was a fragile whisper, warning him that seeking fire only leaves everyone burned. Elias looked at her, then out at the SUV, and the memory of her mistreatment surged back, drowning out his hesitation. The desire for justice was a tide that couldn't be turned back. The final straw came when a glossy invitation was taped to every door. Arthur was throwing a massive gala, and he intended to use his SUV to block off half the street for his guests. The neighbors looked at the flyers, then at Elias. The trap was set. The night of the gala arrived with a cacophony of bass and the screech of tires as Arthur's rich guests filled the neighborhood. Elias watched from his window as Arthur stood on his balcony, the king of a kingdom he didn't own, orchestrating the chaotic parking of his friends' luxury vehicles. It was the ultimate display of entitlement. But beneath the music, a different kind of rhythm was pulsing through the street. The victims of the SUV emerged from their homes, their faces set in grim determination. They moved with the silent, practiced precision of a crew that had rehearsed every step in the shadows of Marcus's garage. While Arthur toasted his success, a heavy-duty rental truck backed silently into the space. Sarah and Marcus led the team, surrounding the black SUV with industrial-grade plastic wrap. They weren't just sealing the car, they were creating a waterproof cocoon. Then came the sand. 500 kilograms of fine grains were poured with clinical efficiency, creating a literal mountain where the status symbol once sat. They shaped and packed it until the SUV was encased, appearing like a massive rectangular dune in the middle of a city street. It was a monument to his arrogance. As the sun rose over the urban horizon, the guests trickled out, their shoes crunching on the grains of sand scattered across the asphalt. Then the front door swung open. Arthur stepped out, his face pale. He stopped dead. Where his black beacon of power should have been, there was only a colossal mound. His keys clicked uselessly in his hand, the remote start chirping from deep within the earth. Arthur didn't just scream, he unraveled. He began clawing at the sand with his bare hands, his suit staining with dust as he shrieked at the silent buildings. He demanded to know who had done it, but the neighborhood responded with a chilling, collective silence. From every window, phones were held high, recording the breakdown of a man whose mask had finally slipped. Elias stepped out of his front door, his cardboard box from his former job in hand. He didn't yell. He walked up to the panting, sand-covered Arthur and handed him a piece of paper. It was the hospital bill for his mother's emergency care, the cost of a missed appointment that could have been avoided if a car hadn't been in the way. "This is what your parking cost me," Elias said, his voice steady. Arthur looked at the bill, then at the mountain of sand, and for the first time, the arrogance in his eyes was replaced by a hollow, terrifying realization. He had no more power here. The viral video of the sand burial reached the repossession agency by noon. Within hours, a tow truck arrived, but because of the sand, they couldn't just drag it away. The spectacle lasted all day, a slow-motion destruction of a reputation. By the time the SUV was finally unearthed and hauled away, Arthur was gone, fleeing the neighborhood in a taxi, leaving debt in his wake. The community didn't just return to normal. Inspired by their action, they established a formal parking pact, ensuring the elderly always had a spot near their doors. Marcus saw Elias's leadership during the war and offered him a supervisory role, a job with better pay and a respect for the people who kept the world moving. Elias sat on his stoop as the sun set. The street finally quiet. His mother was resting inside, her breath easier now that the stress of the conflict had vanished. He realized that respect isn't something bought with a luxury vehicle. It is the currency of the street, earned through empathy and shared struggle. Some parking spots are worth fighting for, not because of the asphalt, but because of the lives that depend on the space they occupy. The sacred spot was empty now, waiting for the next person who truly needed it, a silent witness to a community's